into things. So we once again are learning for the Menucha of Sir Moses Montefiore and Sir Naim Dangur. We are starting unit number 2 of our Shemitah program. Now, we learned in the last unit, we discussed the reasons why we keep Shemitah, the lengthy discussions discussing what among the discussions the Rishonim already raised, what are the reasons for Shemitah, and at the tail of that we asked, is Shemitah primarily focused on people or the community, etc., or is it focused on the land itself? Now, a certain aspect of that raised the question of what happens if I cause the land to work during Shemitah, but I am not working during Shemitah, right? So one way of how can I cause the land to work on Shemitah if I'm not working? One way to do it is to have a guy do it for me. And that's what we mentioned at the end of the Shiur there. The Tosefet the Maharshal, question of if I tell a guy to do the work for me on Shemitah, is that an Isur D'Oraita or D'Rabbanan? But now we're going to go into a different aspect of that, and that is the question of how about a Shabbos clock, right? Beit Shammai say you're not allowed to use a Shabbos clock on Erev Shabbat, right? You're not allowed to set a timer to make the melachot happen for you. That's Beit Shammai's opinion. Beit Hillel disagree and say there's no problem. You can set a Shabbos clock and your melachot happen on their own. There are very relevant ramifications of this question. For example, if I want to use a bread maker and have fresh challah Shabbos morning, so I put the whatever it is, right, the flour and the water and the salt, the oil, whatever I need into the machine before Shabbat, set it to go, and I'll have fresh chalot at 11 a.m. Shabbat morning. Is that okay? So Beit Hillel say it's okay. Beit Shammai say that you're not allowed to do that because you're not allowed to make your utensils, your objects, whatever, right? Your tools work for you on Shabbat, even if you're not part of that. The question is, does the same apply for Shemitah? Is there more room to machmir on Shemitah? So the way to think about it is, what we're saying, there are two ways to look at it, right? One way is to say, if the land ultimately works during Shemitah, that's on you, even if you're not part of it during Shemitah. Another way to look at it is, Shemitah doesn't start during Shemitah. Shemitah starts a bit before Shemitah, right? When Beit Shammai say you're not to set the Shabbos clock before Shabbat, so when are you doing the Chilul Shabbat? Right? Let's say I set a Shabbos clock to I run my bread maker, I run my bread maker to make me fresh challah Shabbos morning. According to Beit Shammai, when was I mechalel Shabbat? There are two ways to look at it, right? You can say when Shabbat morning comes and your bread maker is working, at that point you're mechalel Shabbat. Another way to look at it is when you set that timer, you're mechalel Shabbat, even though you set the timer before Shabbat. Right? These are two ways of looking at that. This touches onto the question of Tosefet Michol al Kodesh. When we discuss Tosefet Michol al Kodesh, there are two ways of understanding what that means. When we say Tosefet Michol al Kodesh, there are two models that we can think of. One model is Shabbat is 24 hours. So let's say Shkia, there's Sfekot, so let's turn it into 24 and a half hours. And we say, but keep Shabbos for 25 to 26 hours. Add more time that is definitely not Shabbat, add it to Shabbat. It's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at the idea, the concept of Tosefet Michol al Kodesh is this last thing I said before, which is Shabbat doesn't start on Shabbat. Shabbat starts a bit before. Let's say, according to Beit Shammai, Shabbat starts on Friday. Shabbat does not start on Friday. But you could mechalel Shabbat on Friday. How are you mechalel Shabbat on Friday? By doing things that will cause Chilul Shabbat on Friday. So I do on Friday, it will cause Chilul Shabbat. Let's see the sugya here. This might sound a bit contrived, but let's see. Let's see in the sugya and see how this plays out. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Tet asks, how do we know that you have to add Michol al Kodesh? Whatever that means. As I said, there are two ways of reading that question. Tanya, over here. רבי עקיבא אומר, אינו צריך לומר חריש וקציר של שביעית, שהרי כבר נאמר, צדך לא תזרע. Rabbi Akiva says, it can't be the pasuk is discussing plowing and planting on Shemitah that we know is asur. אלא חריש של ערב שביעית נכנס השביעית וקציר של שביעית יוצא למוצאי שביעית. Question: why does Rabbi Akiva choose these examples, this order? Charish shel erev shviit nechnas shviit, right? Plowing pre-shmita in such a way that will help the shmita, and reaping the produce of shmita after shmita. Right? What about the other way around? What about reaping produce of the 6th year a minute before shmita and plowing immediately after shmita? Is that okay? Now, you might say, what are you talking about? When I plow before Shemitah, I'm preparing for Shemitah. When I reap post-Shemitah, I'm reaping the benefits of Shemitah. So, of course, there's a difference. You would not say that on Shabbat. When we talk about Tosefet Shabbat and we say, half an hour before Shkia, you should already mekabel Shabbat. Right? Half an hour before Shkia, you should already mekabel Shabbat. At that moment, you're not allowed to do anything, whether it helps you for Shabbat or not, right? You're not allowed to mechal Shabbat anymore from that moment. So, if we want to talk about Tosefet Mechol Kodesh, the same sense the Shabbat, that we mentioned about Shabbat, it should work both ways. It's, once I say, right, I say Shkia now is what, 7:45. So I say, okay, but 7:15 you should already light candles and mekabel Shabbat, right? Fine. Now, okay, am I allowed to cook now? No, that's going to help you for Shabbat. Okay, what about just to draw something? What about just to tear something? What about, right? We say, no, it's Shabbos. You can't do anything. It's Shabbos. So, we're done. Now, if you want to say the same about Shemitah, you'd say, okay, so let's say, I don't know, a month before Shemitah, right? Because it can't be half an hour. That doesn't really make sense. This would be reasonable times. Let's say a month before Shemitah, you have to start keeping Shemitah. You're not allowed to reap the produce on Shemitah. So you can't do that a month before Shemitah either, just like on Shabbos, right? So I just want to emphasize these two models. What is the Gemara asking? The natural way of reading Rabbi Akiva is we're talking about plowing pre-Shemitah for Shemitah itself and picking post-Shemitah what grew during Shemitah, but you can say that's not necessarily so. And you can say, well, maybe we mean a month before and a month after Shemitah, it's already Shemitah and still Shemitah, just like Shabbos, right? Until you make Havdalah, which you can make an hour after the sun has set, right? Easily. It's still Shabbos in all sense, for all intents and purposes. Does the same apply to Shemitah? It sounds from this order not so, right? It sounds like there's preparation for Shemitah, which is Asur, and reaping the benefits of Shemitah, post-Shemitah, getting the fruit, etc., right? That's, right, harvesting what grew during Shemitah. That order, not necessarily, right? Now, Rabbi Yishmael disagrees, not going to go into his limud, and then he learns, right, he learns from Chalish and Katzil, other things, and then they ask, Rabbi Yishmael, Mosifim Nechol Kodesh Minale, okay, so where does he learn this from? Nafkale midetanya, v'yintem nafshotechem, batisha, yachol batisha, תלמוד לומר בערב, אי בערב לכל מי שתחשך, תלמוד לומר בתשעה. הכיצד? מתחילו מתענים מבעוד יום, מלמד שמוסיפים לכל על קודש. אין לי אלא בכניסתו ביציאתו מניין, תלמוד לומר מערב עד ערב. אין לי אלא עם כיפורים שבתות מניין, תלמוד לומר תשבתו. ימים טובים מניין, תלמוד לומר שבתכם. הכיצד? כל מקום שיש בשבות, מוסיפים לכל על קודש. I'm not going to go deeply into the limudim here at the end, that's why I read it quickly. But the main point is, it says, regarding Yom Kippur, it says, now, when does Yom Kippur start? Yom Kippur comes out every single year. It's an astonishing thing. Regardless of Shemitah, not Shemitah, leap year, not leap year, it always comes out on the 10th day of Tishrei. Always. Now, but that's not what it says in the Torah. I mean, it does say that in the Torah. It says another thing in the Torah. It says the 9th day of Tishrei, evening time. 9th day evening. Now, that's not really the way we think about things usually, right? We think about, right, in Judaism, when you say the 10th of Tishrei, we mean after the sun sets on the 9th, right? So why does the Torah mention the 9th at all? So Rabbi Yishmael says it must be the reason the Torah mentions the 9th is because you have to start on the 9th, not on the 10th. Now, what kind of addition is Rabbi Yishmael talking about? It seems natural that Rabbi Yishmael is referring to at what point of the day do you have to start Yom Kippur? You need to start Yom Kippur when the sun sets, or you need to start Yom Kippur half an hour before that. And then once you start Yom Kippur, right, the sun will set on Yom Kippur at 6 o'clock. You say, okay, but at 5:30, you have to stop doing all Melachot. You have to decide, okay, now it's Yom Kippur, right? Now, once it's Yom Kippur for all intents and purposes. We're not going to differentiate and say, well, you can't eat, but you could still light candles, right? But you could still write something down. You say, no, it's Yom Kippur. We're done, right? Half an hour before Yom Kippur, half an hour after Yom Kippur, it's Yom Kippur for all purposes of Yom Kippur. So if we read the Gemara like that, it seems that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael are talking about two different things. I took this to the extreme and said there are two senses of Tosefet Mechor HaKodesh that we're looking at here. Rabbi Akiva is talking about preparing for Shemitah and reaping the benefits of Shemitah. That's the before and after. Rabbi Yishmael is talking about extending the time of the Kodesh beyond its natural limits. Right? Naturally, the day begins after sunset and ends after the stars come out, for argument's sake. And you have to extend that into the previous day. That's very apparent from the very place the place he deduces this from, right? It says in the pasuk Batisha, right? Batisha b'chodesh be'erev. Why Batisha? It's not Batisha. It's on the 10th, right? Right, to tell you, well, you have to start earlier. Okay, meaning in all of our chagim, let's say go on Shabbat, Yom Tov, Yom Kippur, and all of our Shabbat and Yom Tov always extend beyond their natural limits. That's his sense of Tosefet Mechor HaKodesh. That's a very clear, let's say, deduction. Is that the right word? Very clear deduction from the word Batisha. Why is the Torah referring to the day before Yom Kippur? To tell you, well, really, it extends beyond its natural limits. So one sense of Tosefet Mechor HaKodesh, to sum this up, one sense of Tosefet Mechor HaKodesh is this sense, the way I read, Chalish Bakatzir Tishbot, right? Preparing for Shemitah. And a different sense is extending the time of the Kedusha beyond its natural limits, beyond its natural time frame. Now, that's not a very good way of reading the Gemara, of course, because then Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva are answering very different questions, right? So that's a bit of a problem. Let's go deeper into the Rishonim and see what they did with all this. So let's have a look. Says Rashi, Charish erev Shviit, sholech rosh sde ilan erev Shviit, charish sheyoil l'shviit. So Rashi emphasizes we're not talking about we're not talking about just plowing freely 3 days before Shemitah. You might say, well, if it's already Shemitah time, you shouldn't be plowing anyway. Rashi says, no. You're allowed to plow pre-Shemitah as long as it doesn't help benefit the Shemitah, right? So Rashi emphasizes here, it's not just a matter of the time frame, it's a matter of benefiting the Shemitah. And then Rashi says similarly in this next part, Katzil Shviit, Kigon Tva Shevia Shlish B'Shviit, right? The produce that has reached a certain point that will be considered halachically to have grown during Shemitah, that you're not allowed to, even though it's the 8th year. So it's not a matter of extending the time, right? When I say Tosefet Shabbat, we always mean extending the time, right? Shabbat starts, right? The sun sets at 7:45, but you should start at 7:15. We can daven Ma'ariv now around 8:10, something like that. But Shabbat is going to be 8:25, right? Or whatever, right? So it's just extending Shabbat beyond its natural limits. We see that Rashi emphasizes on both sides of the Shemitah that's not the Tosefet we're talking about, right? Rashi, as opposed to that, when he talks about Yom Kippur, ad erev laylahu ve'ad bichlal, when it says me'erev ad erev, it means to include the next evening. So the evening, not the whole evening, obviously. So half an hour into the following evening after Yom Kippur, it's still Yom Kippur. These are two very different. So what I was saying before follows Rashi's interpretation of the Gemara. Rabbi Akiva was saying Yom Kippur. Let's start from Shemitah. Shemitah. When we talk about adding time to Shemitah, we mean starting Shemitah. We mean not benefiting Shemitah and not benefiting from Shemitah. That's post and pre and post, right? As opposed to Yom Kippur, which is an extension of the time frame of Yom Kippur. So these are two ways of reading what we mean by Tosefet Shviit. Rabbi Akiva Eiger asks a very interesting question. Kashyalan, Rabbi Akiva dorot darishken v'yalif mishviit. Hamizeh לא מציין למילא אף רק דין תוספת לעניין איסור מלאכה, אבל לעניין עינוי ביום כיפורים מנהלן. He says, Rabbi Akiva learns, right? Rabbi Akiva was they asked, מוסיפין מחול קודש מניין, right? How do we know that you have תוספת מחול קודש? Rabbi Akiva's answer was, well, חריש על שביעית, right? חריש וקציר, regarding before and after Shviit. So he does not learn this limud about the 9th of Tishrei, correct? Now, so he says, okay, so you're not allowed to do melacha before and after Shemitah. So if now I'm going to want to deduce that you can't do melacha before and after Yom Kippur either, you can't learn that from Batisha because he disagrees with that limud, fine. But if you want to extend it, if you want to carry it over from Shemitah to Yom Kippur, you can only carry over the melachot that you're not allowed to do. Just like before and after Shemitah, there are certain melachot you can't do, so too before and after Yom Kippur, there should be melachot that you can. Before and after Yom Kippur, the melachot that you won't be able to do. What about fasting on Yom Kippur? Could you deduce that? Right? Could you deduct that from one to the other? Right? Could you deduce one to the other? Could you extrapolate? Maybe is the more correct word. Can you extrapolate from the addition of Yom Kippur to the of Shemitah to the addition of Yom Kippur? Now the Sfat Emet says, I don't understand what you're saying. Before we'll read the Sfat Emet in his words, but I'll explain what he argues with Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is breaking down the different aspects, different components of these times of Kedusha, right? Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, well, Shemitah has Yisrei Melacha, Yom Kippur has Yisrei Melacha and also has fasting. How can you extrapolate from Yisrei Melacha to fasting? Sfat Emet says, no, that's not how this works. Sorry. The way this works is we extend the time frame of these Isurim. So if now it's Yom Kippur, what are you not allowed to do? You're not allowed to do work and you must fast. Right? These are two things that happen when Yom Kippur starts. So the question, Rabbi Akiva Eiger's question doesn't really make sense as a Sfat Emet's point. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is asking, how could you extrapolate from Shemitah to Yom Kippur? Because if you want to extrapolate that, you can only learn about the Yisrei Melacha. Says the Sfat Emet, why? That's not the way this works. We extended the time of Isur, so Shemitah starts a bit before and ends a bit after, and Yom Kippur starts a bit before and ends a bit after. Well, why is this even a question? So we see Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So let's start from this. I'll first read the Sfat Emet, explain what he says, and then go back to what Rabbi Akiva, the implication of what Rabbi Akiva was saying. Sfat Emet says, Yesh lomar, against Rabbi Akiva Eiger, Pshita l'Gemara de ma shemosifin havi bichlal kedushat hayom. Once you add the kedusha, you extend the time of kedusha beyond its limits. Mimela mitzvah gam be'achila. That's the natural carrying over. Kivan d'chalav kedushat yom kippurim le'an melacha v'aynu dikari la mosif mechol al kodesh. Right? You add time that was chol, you add that to kodesh. That's what this means. So says Sfat Emet, I don't understand the question. It's just we've extended the limits, the natural limits of the time frame. Once the time frame is extended, all things follow over, are carried over. What's Rabbi Akiva Eiger saying? Rabbi Akiva Eiger is saying, when Rabbi Akiva learns Chalisha v'Katzil, so he's saying you're not to plow pre-Shemitah in a way that'll benefit your Shemitah. Okay, so we're not talking about adding more time to Shemitah. We're talking about extending very, very specific limitations to before Shemitah, right? In that world, I don't know how I could extend that to Yom Kippur. I dare say that the other way, no, let's leave the other way. The other way is a bit more complicated. We have to see another Gemara before I could say the other way. But it seems that Akiva and Sfat Emet are arguing exactly how far to take what I was saying before, right? Sfat Emet says, also Rabbi Akiva means that we extend the time of Shemitah beyond its natural limits, time limits, and the same will follow for any other Shabbos or Chag. Rabbi Akiva says, no. We've only, if you want to learn if you want to say that plowing before Shemitah into Shemitah, that's a problem. I can't extrapolate fasting. That's a totally different world. That's different. That's not the same. That's not the same kind of extension. That seems to be the machloket over here. Turei Even takes us farther and says there's no relationship between the addition of the time of Shemitah and the addition of the time of Shabbos, basically based on what we were saying so far. The point I made before, right? What I said before, that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael seem to be answering very different questions if you read Rashi, right? Rashi said Rabbi Akiva is answering, Rabbi Akiva the Tana, is answering the question of the time before and after Shemitah, and Rabbi Yishmael is answering the question of Rabbi Yishmael is answering the question of extending the limit, the natural time limit. These are two very different questions. So I really don't know what's going on here. Because these seem to be answering very different questions. In other words, it's two different questions. Are you allowed to? All right, let's take this to the extreme. Are you allowed to set a Shabbos clock on Friday? Well, Rabbi Akiva seemed to answer that question because it would follow that according to Rabbi Akiva, just as you can't plow pre-Shemitah into Shemitah, so too you can't set a Shabbos clock to water your plants before Shemitah into Shemitah, right? Those two work in the same realm. So that question would not answer the question of how long before Shabbat do you need to light candles and decide, okay, now it's Shabbos. Nothing to do with that. Its answer is a very different question of, are you allowed to set a Shabbos clock? Says Turei Even, I don't understand. Rabbi Akiva is asking, are you allowed to set a Shabbos clock? Rabbi Yishmael is asking, do you have to start Shabbos half an hour before the time starts? These are totally different questions. So let's see the Turei Even. Kasheli Sugyan Azal de Rabbi Akiva Yalif Tosefet B'Shabbat v'Yom Tov Mecharish el Erev Shviit Yotzel Shviit v'Katzir Shviit Yotzel Motzei Shviit. So it seems the pshat of the sugya seems to be that Rabbi Akiva extrapolates Tosefet of Shabbat and Yom Tov from Tosefet Shviit. Ani tamea. I don't understand. מה עניין תוספת זה דאלף רבי עקיבא מחריש וקציר לתוספת זה של שבת ויום טוב? Why? תוספת של חרישה ערב שביעית נכנס השביעית, היינו שלא יחרוש בערב שביעית חרישה המועילה לשדה ואילן בשביעית. לא שמינן מינה שיהיה אסור לקצור בערב שביעית, וכן לחרוש במוצאי שביעית משום תוספת, right? There's no way of extrapolating בחריש וקציר, which is supposed to benefit the Shemitah and benefit from the Shemitah, the other way. And say, well, Shemitah started, so now you can't pick the fruit, right? Or Shemitah ended, but, right, the 7th year is over, but Shemitah isn't over, you're not allowed to plow yet, right? There's no such halacha. אילו תוספת שבת ויום טוב לגמרי להפך, מותר לחרוש קודם שבת ויום טוב, חרישה מועילה לשבת ויום טוב, right? Or in our terms, you're allowed to set a Shabbos clock. You're allowed to set your gardening system to on Friday, 2 hours before Shabbat, to go off on Shabbat, as in to go on Shabbat, right? To start watering on Shabbat and to end right after and right during Shabbat, right? Which would presumably seem to be a problem on Shemitah, based on Rabbi Akiva's conception. וכן מותר לקצור בכל פירות שהביאו שליש בשבת ויום טוב. אסור לחרוש ולקצור, וכן שאר כל מלאכות סמוך לשבת ויום טוב, מעט לפני מאחרים, משום תוספת שבת ויום טוב. תוספת שבת ויום טוב means it becomes Shabbat in all senses, as opposed to Shemitah is very specific. There's no relationship between these two. So he says, I really don't understand what's going on in the sugya. Rabbi Yishmael is talking about one kind, Rabbi Akiva is talking about a different kind. This doesn't really make any sense to me. That's what Turei Even points out. Okay. Beseder. So just to sum up what we've done so far, then we'll go into the Gemara in Moed Katan. So we saw the Gemara in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah asks, how do we know that there's Tosefet Michol al Kodesh, whatever that means? We said there are two ways of understanding what that question means. It could mean How do I know that I'm not already on Friday, already before Yontiv, before any holy time starts? I already need to make sure that there's no transgression of the holiness, the sanctity of that day, right? By not setting a Shabbos clock, by not plowing, by not whatever it is. That's one way of reading the question. Another way of reading the question is, another way of reading the question is, how do we know that all times of sanctity, all holy days, need to go beyond their very limited exact time limit? And these are two very different questions. And it seems even worse that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael answered the two different questions. Rabbi Akiva seems to indicate that you're not allowed to prepare for Shemitah or benefit from Shemitah. And from there, he wants to extrapolate Tosefet Shviit Kodesh. And Rabbi Yishmael is talking about an extension of the time frame of these days, right? This, the Turei Even says, so I don't understand this whole conversation. There's no conversation going on here. We're talking about two very different things. And Rabbi Akiva Eger seems to say, yeah, it seems that Rabbi Akiva really is learning only very, very specific way of extending. And I don't see how that would be carried over. Sfat Emet says, no, we're not. There's no argument here. We're talking about extending the time, the holy time, beyond its limits. This would be true about Shemitah as well. So we have a bit of a conundrum, and with that, we will take a